What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Front Page Fitness. It is me, Eric Trexler, joined as always by the Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Lauren, how are we doing today?
It's been a bit of a rough day. You know how people will use the saying, when one door opens, another one opens, or when one door closes, a window opens.
Okay.
And so this is about like resilience and optimism. So a couple of hours ago, I closed my door and my kitchen window shattered into like 875 million pieces. And that did not really encourage a lot of optimism, but I was resilient. And now I'm just a little cold because the thing about winter in Canada is like windows are kind of essential.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's insane to use the W word. It's March 23rd, so that's a good indication that you need to leave wherever. If you're calling it winter on March 23rd, you need to leave and go somewhere else, really anywhere. I am sorry to hear that. That is very chaotic and certainly not pleasant. I don't know what I would do. You've kind of unlocked a new concern on my end, because if I did that, I've got two cats and those cats will be out the window in 2 seconds. So I have no idea what I would do to rectify that situation. But luckily, I'm familiar with the athleticism of your dogs, and I think you're in the clear.
Yes, luckily no one was harmed in this freak occurrence.
Yes, Parker, for those who don't know, Parker, her legs are probably about 3 inches long. So I don't see her getting up out of a window. So that's for the best. But yeah, other than that, anything going on we got a little early bird special going on. Late notice to the folks in the live chat, but we jumped on about 2.5 hours early because, as everyone knows, I am in extremely high demand giving a guest lecture at our normal recording time. So thank you to the very gracious Dr. Lauren, who has accommodated my very busy speaking schedule. And you know what, Lauren?
Yeah, so
I was not given an opportunity to choose walkout music for this academic guest lecture, which is insane because you got guest music for yours.
a walkout song is a
Yeah.
very important part of any presentation.
Yeah, I gave a guest lecture last week on kidney physiology, and I didn't do walkout music for that either. So I need to I need to start figuring
That's
this
such
out.
an exciting topic.
I know. Yeah, everyone loves kidneys and renal physiology. So we were talking about the loop of Henle, and there was no music.
All right, so this weekend, a lot of people sent me a reel. They actually screen recorded it for me because this creator blocked me a long time ago. Dr. Mary Claire Haver, I mentioned that she might have been misinterpreting the data on weighted vests. She didn't like that.
Ooh.
I was blocked forever. But she's continuing to content create and comment about exercise, nutrition, fat loss, etc. And so people asked me if I would respond to this reel, which I will do on Instagram. But the annoying thing about Instagram is it can be difficult to say everything you want to say in 45 seconds. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to actually take a look at what she said and go through the full paper and hopefully give some of the listeners who are either in the live chat with us now or watching on replay some tools for how do we interpret a new paper, and how are we describing something as breaking news, and does this actually kind of change the way that we think about the menopause transition and metabolism. And I think you are the perfect person with whom to do this because you happen to be a metabolism researcher.
I do happen to be. I do want to make a statement here. I know based on my fan mail, I know there's a lot of people who tune into the show basically just to look at my face. I get a lot of that in my DMs and
Right.
my emails. I'm going to put the paper up as you kind of lead the show. It's going to be covering my face, but the good people can still see Dr. Lauren, who's really running the show today. So I will be kind of a ghostly voice from above as the good viewers in the YouTube live chat are looking at the paper itself, and of course Lauren as she steers the ship here. So Lauren, it is true. I'm owning up to the allegation. I am a metabolism researcher, and I am happy to follow your lead here as we go through this paper, and we will do our best to not make this a very painful 3-hour walkthrough, but you let me know which highlights you want to hit, and I will be scrolling and highlighting and supporting you every step of the way.
Awesome. And it looks like we have people in the live chat from Chicago, South Africa, and Israel. How cool.
All right, what's up, folks? Good to see everybody in the live chat. Loving it. And one thing I don't love is that Rob commented that he is enjoying the live stream with his kitten, who's currently snuggled up on his lap. I fully support that. It just really harms me spiritually when other people are living out my dreams in real time. And here I am with no kitten to speak of.
Yeah. A furry friend definitely makes it better. We should start streaming with our pets in the room.
That would be great,
Mine
but
just might start barking.
I think Izzy would be fine with that. Chai is a very chaotic cat, so it just wouldn't work. She's like
Yeah.
constantly like,
Unplugging microphones and things like that.
oh, she loves a good cable to chew on. She loves bumping her head into things aggressively. If you don't look straight at her and make eye contact, she will meow because she's very attention starved. So she's a lovely cat.
Yeah.
I cherish her, but she is not a good podcast host.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. So let's first break down or summarize what Dr. Haver said in her post. So the paper which we'll go through is sort of up in the background, and she describes this as breaking news for menopause. And she says that the calories in, calories out crowd is going to be up in arms. Because a new narrative review looked at resting metabolism, sleep metabolism, the thermic effect of food, and calories burned during physical activity, and that they all decline during the menopause transition. And this is due to decreasing estrogen and increasing FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And it's not about willpower and discipline if people are struggling with weight loss. This is just biology, and it's hormonal, and women deserve better than a spreadsheet and a step counter. I want to start with the last part because I agree that we shouldn't be shaming people or saying just figure it out and eat less. We can talk about fat loss in a much more supportive way that acknowledges all of the challenges associated with weight loss, some of which do get more difficult over time due to a variety of different circumstances. But does this paper necessarily, debunk calories in, calories out? No, it doesn't. It summarizes some of the literature we have to date, looking at metabolism, measured in various ways in various populations with different study designs. And all of those are really key points here. And we'll start just, I think, with a discussion of a narrative review, because whenever we see the term narrative review attached to a paper, we need to understand that this is not new data like we would get from a clinical trial or a cross-sectional study where we're actually doing a study and collecting data. A narrative review is a summary of existing data, and the authors have a lot of room to pull whichever studies they want. So usually the goal is, let's summarize this, and then let's either say this is the current state of the literature, or here are some areas that future scientists should explore to expand our knowledge on the topic, so they can point out some of the gaps in the literature. And we do this in all areas of science, very common, but it's key to remember that there's no requirement in a narrative review to sort of include or exclude certain studies based on a set of parameters. When we do what's called a systematic review, then we have a very explicit search strategy where we say, I am searching for all of the papers in the English language, in humans, in these age groups that include the keywords, and then we'd have all of these keywords, and that would make sure that we kind of pull all of the science that meets a very specific, explicit set of criteria. So they're a little bit different because in the narrative review, we can kind of pull from whichever citations we want. And from a systematic review, we're required to do this sort of step by step. This is what we're including and why.
Absolutely, yeah. And the people will refer to something called the hierarchy of evidence, which kind of lists these different types of evidence or types of research in a sequential way or kind of an ordered way in terms of what is considered basically the most valid with the lowest risk of bias, so to speak. And generally speaking, you look at something like a systematic review with or without a meta-analysis component as being really up near the tippy top of that hierarchy, depending on who you talk to, often at the top. Whereas narrative reviews, as you alluded to, because there's no rigid criteria in terms of what studies you wish to be talking about, there is a lot of potential for bias. Now, bias, it's important to understand, when we talk about someone being biased, there's usually an extremely negative connotation that almost like makes it seem like there's some intention behind it. But it's important to understand bias can be fully unintentional as well. And that's why it's really nice to just lay out a systematic search process so that people who are researchers don't lean in unknowingly to some of their pre-existing biases in terms of which sources of evidence they tend to highlight or really focus on. So this was a narrative review, which is basically the four authors of the paper said, here's an interesting topic and we'd like to tell you all about it. And that's about where the guardrails end.
That's right. And I'll say the interpretation stated in Haver's reel isn't necessarily reflective of the author's opinions, and we can kind of go through that as well. But if you just read the abstract, you don't really get the full picture here because these authors go kind of category by category into discussing, okay, here are some studies looking at this energy expenditure at rest. Here are some studies looking at thermic effect of food. And so they're kind of laying it out and then looking at it in a what we do and don't know. But some of the studies they included are extremely different types of study design. So meaning if we're talking about menopause, maybe we have a group of people who are pre-menopause and a group of people who are post-menopause. Maybe we have a group of people who are pre-menopause and we follow them over time and we test them every year. Maybe we have a group of rodents and we remove their ovaries and we look at a bunch of signaling pathways and hormones, and then we draw some conclusions from that type of study. And so all of these are included in this conversation. And it's important, I think, for us to just sort of go through what exactly are these papers looking to tell us? How did they measure it? And why, in some cases, do we have lists of studies that are giving us completely different results?
Perfect. Yeah, let's dig in. I'm on board.
All right. So they start by kind of giving an introduction and some background as to the interest in this topic, because there is an interest as to if there are changes in people's ability to lose weight or fat pattern distribution, storage changes, then if there is something to this with menopause specifically, then how can we identify what that might be? And so there's a lot of interest in this topic. I fully agree that there's interest in this topic. But when we talk about measuring metabolic rate or metabolism in general, you can measure this in different ways. So there's our resting metabolism, or how many calories are we burning if we don't do anything. And then there's the exercise, the energy that we're expending during exercise, which is a different component of metabolism. There's the thermic effect of food, or how much energy it's actually taking us to kind of digest and break down the food that we're eating. And all of these are measured in a different way, and they are of a different relative importance to kind of the overall picture when we think about weight loss. So maybe if you could give us a bit of a like metabolic rate 101, what are we talking about here? Why are we separating resting metabolism, from sleep metabolism, from energy expenditure during physical activity, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is, we're trying to get an idea of how many total calories somebody burns in most cases. And one of the reasons we divide it up or carve it up is because it's usually only practical to measure certain components at a given time, right? So, for example, the most commonly measured component of energy expenditure is resting energy expenditure, because basically you bring someone into a lab, you have them chill for 30 minutes. And once they're kind of all, back down to a resting state, they might have been rushing up the stairs to try to get to the lab on time for their morning appointment. But you kind of just have them chill. You measure for 30 minutes and you say, hey, that's how many calories you burn at rest, right? But then there's questions of like, well, what about the thermic effect of feeding? It's like, well, technically we would have to, actually bring you in, give you a standardized meal. Those measurements tend to have a lot of volatility. And at the end of the day, they're not a huge component of total daily energy expenditure. And in fact, in most studies, like you can just kind of call that 10% of total energy expenditure and people will say, okay, that's fine. Like that works. Then there's the, we can do some kind of exercise test on a treadmill and kind of measure your expenditure during that and, call it your exercise energy expenditure, which will be different from your non-exercise. But at the end of the day, like it's really, there's two reasons that we would divide it up like this. Number one, because you have to like measure these things so deliberately that you must measure them one at a time if you're going to like, bring someone into a lab and do it. Or another reason to do that is maybe you have a specific interest in figuring out what type of energy expenditure is being changed, right? So, for example, we just published a paper a few weeks ago where we were looking at the ways that people might experience compensatory reductions in energy expenditure when they increase their physical activity or exercise level. And for reasons that I don't fully understand yet, which I'm not ashamed to say, that's kind of the point of research. If you only study things you're totally confident in, then you're not actually answering questions, which is the whole point. But for reasons I don't fully understand, we saw that when people became significantly more active in terms of their exercise or physical activity levels, we saw a more pronounced reduction in sleeping metabolic rate than resting metabolic rate, which are, of course, different because, there are different processes happening during sleep versus when we're awake. And also there's the potential influence for kind of the what we would call in the clinical sense arousal of just being awake and having your brain turned on and having responses to the environment around you. So all that is to say, Lauren, these are all measured very differently. Now, my lab here at Duke, my lab, I say as if I own it, the lab in which I work, we use doubly labeled water, which allows us to measure total energy expenditure. So rather than having to bring you in and have you do exercise and have you rest and have you eat something and do all these individual measurements, we just say, hey, drink this water, and would you mind giving us urine a few times over the next 7 days? And we use that to figure out over a period of approximately 1 week, how many total calories were burned when we combine everything together: sleep, eating, exercise, you name it. And so certainly, you were mentioning that they're not all equally important. Of course, sleeping metabolic rate's pretty important because you're doing that, 8 hours a day, ideally, or, between 5 and 8 for most people. Resting metabolic rate is certainly important. That's going to usually make up, honestly, 60 to 70% of your total daily energy expenditure. And sleep kind of gets lumped into that. But then, how much does exercise matter? It depends. If you're sedentary, almost none because you don't do it, right? So it ends up being like none of your energy expenditure because it doesn't exist. And then, of course, non-exercise activity thermogenesis can be a big deal just because, I mean, if you've ever like done manual labor, it's like you may not have worked out today, but you burned tons of calories as you were kind of laying that driveway paver brick by paver brick, speaking from experience, unfortunately. So that's kind of the 101 rundown of metabolism, how we measure it, why we measure it, and why we would bother kind of dividing it up.
Yeah, and I'll just point out the method that you just described, the doubly labeled water, that would be considered sort of the gold standard because it's not just taking one snapshot in time and then kind of assuming, okay, this is going to be the same for the other 23 hours in the day. We're saying, okay, we actually can measure this and incorporate all of the things you are doing from day to day to day by using these metabolic tracers.
Yeah.
And I think with that kind of methodological component, although we don't necessarily need to do too deep a dive, it is important because people will, and they actually in this paper refer to fat oxidation, or are we burning fat, and are women burning less fat post menopause than they did pre-menopause. And I think that even just that topic is often not properly explained because you hear fat burning and you think fat loss, when really, when we are utilizing fat as fuel, we are tapping into stored fat as and using it for all these processes in the body. And so we're doing that all the time, right? We need energy just to exist, to think, to sit here in my chair, certainly to walk around and to digest food. So we're always breaking down energy, and when we consume as food, we store those either in the context of carbohydrates, we're storing glycogen; in the context of dietary fat, we're storing lipids and triglycerides, and then they are broken down and used for energy. So we are to some extent either using more fat as fuel or more carbohydrates or stored glycogen as fuel, or in some cases we're using a combination. But these are not fat loss. So if you hear, okay, I'm not burning as much fat anymore, or I'm not oxidizing as much fat anymore, or if after this workout I burned more fat for the next 30 minutes, none of that is actually telling us about weight loss. It's just telling us about what substrate we are using for fuel at a given point in time.
Yeah, I think the best metaphor for that is like imagine that you were doing a transaction at like a cashier, like a cash register, and for some reason there's a banker standing right next to you who's happy to convert your money into whatever currency you like. You know, they got their pockets full of all these different currencies, and it's like, well, the thing I just ordered is $19. And it's like, what if I converted those to euros and then paid? And I'm like, well, today's conversion rate is what it is. It's still going to cost you the same economically. You can pay in whatever currency you want, right? So you can pay in US dollars, euros, Swiss francs, you name it. You can do whatever, kind of currency exchange that you want with the person next to you, but you need to give me $19 worth of money right now, right? And so that's kind of what's going on with metabolism, is that, the energy budget that we have for the day, the balance between intake and expenditure, that's your bill. Like that's the amount of energy you need to cover. And it doesn't really matter if you decide I'm going to pay half of it in US dollars and half in euros. Like it just costs what it costs. And your body's going to figure out the balance of macronutrients that it's going to oxidize based frankly on what's available and some other contextual factors like exercise intensity, things of that nature. So at the end of the day, like you said, the take home point is you can play around with all those conversions all that you want, moving it from this to that to the other. But when your body has, it's going to have energy expenditure needs, it's going to have energy coming in on a regular basis, it's going to make it work by using the substrates that are available. So yeah, it is tempting when you hear like, fat oxidation went down by 10%. You think, oh no, I'm going to gain a bunch of fat. It's like, well, fat oxidation went down by 10%. Carbohydrate oxidation increased by the exact amount needed to kind of cover that difference. And at the end of the day, the take home point is that your stored glycogen is altered by an basically undetectable degree, and energy balance just is what it is. And your total fat stores are fundamentally unchanged.
So why don't we pull up the paper and we can go to the first table where they're kind of summarizing some of these papers and looking at energy expenditure at rest, and they have a little bit of fat oxidation data in there too.
Yes. So we got the table up here. Good to see Scott Van Pelt, notable sportscaster, publishing in 1997. Love to see that for him. So what are we looking at in this table?
And if you're in the live chat and you have questions, feel free to type those in, and we will address them along the way. So when I say it's important that we read the whole paper or take a look at the whole paper, this really highlights why. Because you'll note here in this table, we have the study design. So were we actually following people over time, like the Duval paper? They say study design, that was longitudinal. Okay, so we're actually looking at people and following those same people. So that reduces some of that variability between people when we do a cross-sectional study where we just say, okay, here's what we're seeing in these women who are, over the age of 50, and here's what we're seeing in these women who are under the age of 50, and then can we draw some comparisons? So obviously with a longitudinal study, it's harder. It's harder to have people enroll and stay there and return to the lab year after year. That requires more resources. It tends to be more expensive. So we're going to see fewer longitudinal study designs and more cross-sectional comparisons when we look at some of this data. The other thing that I'll highlight is how we are measuring. So we talked earlier about the doubly labeled water. What you'll see here is indirect calorimetry is the most common. And then we have one study with a metabolic chamber. Do you want to speak to that briefly?
Sorry, run that by me again.
Just the way that we are assessing metabolic rate in terms of indirect calorimetry versus metabolic chamber.
Yeah, yeah. So usually, like with indirect calorimetry, like you'll see in the table, it'll say like ventilatory hood. So basically they're going to be like, hey, lay down on this table. We're going to put this like plastic hood over you. You kind of look like you're wearing like an astronaut helmet or something. And you're just sitting there and you're breathing. You're laying down on this table, and it's just measuring the gas that you are exhaling, comparing that to room air, and kind of figuring out how much oxygen is being consumed, how much carbon dioxide is being produced, and running back a whole bunch of calculations to therefore determine caloric expenditure, with of course some assumptions baked into the mix. But also, we've got these kind of like metabolic chambers where, and we have a metabolic chamber in our lab here at Duke, which is it's really cool. It's like basically an apartment. It looks like a little like studio apartment, but it is airtight. And so instead of like placing you in there and laying down, being totally still and capturing this gas from like straight out of your mouth, basically, you're just kind of sitting in this room, in this metabolic chamber. You're hanging out. And of course, they'll tell you, hey, rest, don't move around, stuff like that. But the metabolic chamber is nice because, and sometimes you'll see it called like whole room indirect calorimetry. But the whole idea is you're instead of having this hood over your face, which some people honestly will like kind of hyperventilate a little bit. They'll get a little claustrophobic. That alone, if you alter your breathing pattern, can kind of mess things up a little bit. It's not critically terrible, like critical in terms of the impact, but generally speaking, with whole room indirect calorimetry or with a metabolic chamber that's set up as an entire room, people can kind of relax a little better. But that's kind of the main difference, is just what kind of setup you're using.
Right. You'll also notice here, if you look at the table and they clarify the number of participants in the third column. So here we have premenopausal women, postmenopausal women, and then you'll see a study by Melanson where it says GnRH Ag plus PL. Those are mice. So we're including rodents in this table. And in fact, those are the only subjects. That's the only study where they used that whole room indirect calorimetry in the rodent study. So all of these other papers that they decided to put in this table use that indirect measure. And notably, they didn't include a paper that I cite quite frequently when I look at, okay, when are we actually seeing major changes in energy expenditure across the lifespan? Because a paper from your colleague looked at people, men and women of literally every age group. It's one of the most robust studies,
Yeah.
and it was using that doubly labeled water method that we talked about, and that shows no real changes until approximately age 63 in a very large sample.
Yeah, huge limitation though. It was the age range that they studied was between, I think, like 8 weeks old and like 96 years old. So technically we don't know what happens after 97. So huge limitation to keep in mind with that. And we don't know what's happening in those first couple weeks. But other than that, yeah, it was pretty
Right.
solid. And one thing I
Yeah.
do want to mention, so I think it's more common, I believe. I don't do rodent research, so I'm inferring here. But when they talk about whole room indirect calorimetry, and it's specifically these mice studies, basically what you're looking at there is like a glass shoebox instead of like an apartment room setup. But yeah, it's basically the same idea, but you can just scale it down super tiny for the little mice.
Yeah, and I'll also add that, although the rodent models are often used to generate hypotheses about the menopause transition, it's very dissimilar to the menopause transition because you are removing the ovaries from the rodent, you're shutting down hormone production in a way that is dissimilar to the way that this happens in humans. In humans, it's a much longer transition with many fluctuations along the way, as opposed to kind of an on-off switch. And so you'll look at these papers and say, okay, this is how it's responding in ovarian suppression, but we need to be really careful about how we apply rodent data to humans. Really, they're just good for hypothesis generation. And we've seen this in muscle. When you look at some of the older research in rodents who had their ovaries removed, and there was a valid hypothesis generated to say, hey, something's happening with muscle when we remove the rodent's ovaries. Maybe there's something to these hormones or the absence of these hormones when it comes to maintaining muscle. However, many studies have been done in human women at this point, looking at estrogen-based hormone therapy versus no hormone therapy over the menopause transition and the ability to maintain lean mass. And there doesn't seem to be a difference. So we don't have evidence on the muscle side to say hormone therapy is protective or it's going to help us maintain muscle mass. And I highlight this because that really was observed across many rodent studies and it was really promising. But when we explored it in humans, it just didn't pan out.
Yeah, and I do want to just reiterate one thing that's kind of crazy about rodent studies for this particular research question. I mean, I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. Like you said, it's good for generating hypotheses, but it's worth noting that mice don't do menopause. Right, so like you're literally studying menopause in a species in which that does not happen. There's only like a handful of species on the planet that actually live past menopause for like a meaningful stretch of time. Humans happen to be one of them. So yeah, it is a very unique physiological occurrence that does require some pretty specified research in species where, for example, it actually happens.
Right. And even when we start looking at the sleeping energy expenditure, that's the next table that we
Yeah.
have
Before
here.
we go there, though, Lauren, one thing that I just want to remark,
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I'm throwing you off your flow here, but I am just amazed because I knew we were going to talk about this paper. I did not know about the claims that were made about it. And like the way you describe them, and this is probably Lauren being, duplicitous, very dishonest, deceiving Lauren, her normal shtick here. But
Yeah,
assuming
that is
that
me.
your representation of the claims are true and accurate, um, I was stunned to hear that somebody made some kind of like bombastic, bold conclusions from this because as people at home will see if they have their screen put up really big on their computer, this table one is like almost all question marks. I think it's worth noting, like, there's just a tremendous number of question marks. You cannot look at this table without saying, oh, so we just don't know much about this, do we? And so the idea, like, even just that's my like nuanced statistical analysis here is too many question marks to look at this table and say, this changes everything. Calories in, calories out is dead.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier the difference between the narrative review and the more systematic review. And if we were to get to the point where we would do a meta-analysis, you try to gather data that is as similar as you can, right? So
Right.
you want data that you can compare to like data. We clearly don't have that here. And the take home would be, well, we probably need to either do more research, maybe let's ignore the rodent data, or if we are going to say that there's an age-related decline, but potentially not a menopause-specific decline, then we would acknowledge that that is a wrinkle in our ability to answer this question because age and menopause are inextricably linked. So if there is an age-related decline and then you're observing it in women who are aging, is it aging or is it menopause? And if it's happening around the menopause transition, can you then confidently attribute that to estrogen, or are we then taking another big leap there?
Yeah, and Lauren, to that point, if you just go through table one, which I assume is supposed to be like a pretty, this is kind of at the heart of the paper, going down
Yeah.
through the changes in absolute energy expenditure, I'm not going to cherry pick. I'm going to go through all of them very concisely. The first one says RMR drops after 51. That has nothing, that's not menopause, that's the age, right? So there's no actual distinction there based on menopausal status. The second one, RMR drops with age, but not menopausal status. So specifically saying it was just age. The third one, question mark. The fourth one, decrease in post compared to pre. That's not compared to an actual control group based on menopausal status. Then the next one is a rodent study. The next one says RMR increases 2 years after the onset of menopause. The next one says no difference between groups. The next one says no difference between groups. The next one says question mark. The next one says dropped sleeping metabolic rate for all women, nothing to do with menopausal status. Next one's sleeping metabolic rate drops in both groups, nothing to do with menopausal status. Next one, no change in TEF between all groups, increase in TEF for all groups, no change in both groups. There's not a single one in this table that actually says we saw a drop in the women going through the menopausal transition, and that was different from the women who were not. Not a single one, Lauren.
Yep.
But anyway, calories in, calories out is dead, and this paper killed it. And it all has to do with menopause. Like, how did we get there? It's Lauren,
Yeah.
like you have to like no, I'm sorry. I'm grabbing the microphone here because you have to understand to make those types of claims, it wouldn't even be good enough if half of these leaned in that direction. I am telling you, there are zero. And that is a problem to me, Lauren.
Well, and keep in mind, these are the ones that the authors picked, right? So these are the ones that they feel like best support their argument for this narrative review.
Yeah.
Like, so this is the best they could do to say there are changes. I don't know. It,
That's this is like I didn't like read this paper very thoroughly before we got into this because we just kind of decided yesterday we were going to do this like last night, and I had family things going on. You totally disrupted my Sunday evening, but this is awful. I'm not saying the paper is bad. I'm just saying like this does not this doesn't bear any resemblance to the types of claims that you ran across my desk.
yeah, and I think this is one of the things that is really frustrating for me about science communication or the way people are trying to be science communicators on Instagram because all due to Dr. Haver, I don't think you read the paper. I think you read the abstract and decided to put it up on a green screen behind you to bolster your claims and promote your book. Because if you had actually scrolled through table one, you might have paused and said, you know what? I don't think I can make any of these claims to a high degree of confidence.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that. You just took a very heated shot across the bow while my face was covered. So I'm hoping I won't be a casualty that gets pulled into this war because that was definitely a shot fired. Dr. Lore
Well,
doesn't mess around with her research.
listen,
Everyone knows it.
what I'm saying is if I don't see how an evidence-based person can read this, and make those conclusions. So I think I'm being charitable by saying I don't think she read it.
Yeah. So on to table two. From me, I'm going down that list, and again, there are a lot of question marks and a lot of entries that basically just say no difference or all women had the same change in the study.
Right. And so the that first table was resting, energy expenditure, and sleep, and the thermic effect of food. And in this table, we're looking at physical activity, and the substrate oxidation, which we sort of explained earlier. So this isn't really telling us that there are changes in energy expenditure either at rest or during physical activity from pre to peri to post menopause. That's not what this data is telling us. And when we go down to the figure two, which is the
Yep.
next page. So this is their figure, non-resting energy expenditure. So they have physical activity, and they have energy expenditure and substrate oxidation, and they're saying that energy expenditure decreases in perimenopause. I'm not sure based on what, and then they're not sure what substrate oxidation does.
Yeah.
Where are they getting that from?
Uh, I don't know. It's probably hidden somewhere in the paragraphs that are about the table where we did not really see a strong signal for that.
Okay.
Yeah, so they must have taken some latitude with their interpretation. But yeah, I'm zoomed in for people who are on YouTube right now in the live chat. Zoomed in on figure two, the one that says non-resting energy expenditure, right, Lauren? And yeah, so
Yes.
for perimenopause, it says energy expenditure drops. That's a very confident downward pointing arrow. I think that's a little out of bounds. And then yeah, question mark for substrate oxidation. It's worth noting here that of the 8 indicators that are in this table, 5 of them are question marks, and I think those energy expenditure arrows are pretty questionable. So I think probably at least 7 of the 8 should probably be question marks. And I haven't read closely enough to make a determination on the eighth, which is substrate oxidation post menopause.
Yeah. Then we move on to so I think if we can be if we can be open-minded, then
Okay.
we can say there's not enough data to confidently make these conclusions. I would say based on this data, my interpretation would be to say that we don't have an indication that this is changing across the menopause transition, because in order for me to say there is an indication and there is some this is worth exploring, then I would want to see at least half of the papers pointing to a degree of difference, and we don't have that here. But again, in this type of paper, you can choose which references you'd like to include, and you can also choose how you interpret them. And so it's subject to interpretation. If I were peer reviewing this paper, I would probably have said, how are you guys creating this figure? It's not really an appropriate graphic depiction of the data that you are referencing. And throughout the paper, there's really no acknowledgement of the inclusion of the rodent data as well. And
Yeah.
that is a big red flag to me, because if you are just going to say this has been observed, and this can generate a hypothesis for future studies, then I'll give it to you. You can cite the rodent paper, but tell me it's in rodents. And if you're going to lump this all into a table and say we should be giving all of these studies equal weight, rodent studies should not be in these tables.
Yeah. Now, Lauren, you mentioned a red flag, and we do have someone in the live chat who asked a question here. First of all, they asked, what are they supposed to do when they hit the age of 97? Since the Poncer paper we talked about earlier only went up to age 96, the answer is honestly, you're completely out of luck. We have no idea. You might say that there's a trend of information going from the age of 0 to 96, and you can kind of extrapolate, but that would be obviously completely inappropriate. But the real question was, for those of us that normally don't read scientific papers, what are some things we should be looking for when we read these types of papers? So, like a narrative review like this, where, honestly, I agree with you, Lauren. I think now that I'm looking at the tables in detail, that abstract kind of comes out of left field, and the figure. It's one of the challenges is that figures like this, there's either the arrow either points down, up, or it's a question mark. There's not a really good way to say, here's how strong the evidence is, here's how large the effect is, things like that. And so I think there is a lot of potential for some serious misunderstanding when you read a paper like this. So, in line with the person in the live chat with a question, what are some things that you look out for, just to make sure that you can put some faith in the results that you're reading?
Well, again, not relying just on the abstract is incredibly important because you're looking at somebody else's very short summary, and we need to actually dig into the paper. So in this case, and it's a narrative review, so it's a summary of other studies, and so we do kind of what you and I are doing now, and we say, okay, well, what are these studies? Who is the population? And is this appropriate for how I am going to interpret the overall message? The other figure that they have here is all about hormone signaling and the potential estrogen mechanism as to how it could affect metabolic actions. Every reference for this figure is in rodents. And so once again, when you see the rodent data, that is a time to take a pause and say, okay, this is interesting, but this is not conclusive. We don't know if this applies to humans. And so we need to be very cautious about our interpretation.
Yeah, the abstract. I'm being facetious here. This is not kind. And as a researcher, I really need to be careful about throwing stones in this glass hill house that I've built around myself. But the abstract almost reads as if they had this elegant figure put together, and they're like, "Well, now what are we gonna do?" After looking at the data in the tables, right? Like it's like, well, here's how it's supposed to work. But yeah, you go through the actual human data, and you're like, right, but if all these relationships, I mean, these are elegant relationships that are meticulously uncovered through a lot of mechanistic research, which it makes sense to uncover a lot of the mechanisms in rodents where you have, or other animal models where you have an exceptional level of control. It can help you isolate things. But at the end of the day, like it's one thing to say, hey, here's how things ought to happen. But you got to bring me back to the empirical data where you say, and here's how it plays out in a way that matters. And so, yeah, usually that's going to mean, I need to see not just consistent, statistically significant effects where there are very obvious differences in energy expenditure. That's the first hurdle. But the second hurdle is actually saying, and by the way, this magnitude of difference actually matters in a real way. In a way that affects what you do and how you live, right? So, for example, you can have a whole bunch of studies that find, in theory, you put them all together and you say, on average, we see that total daily energy expenditure, decreases by 31 calories a day after menopause. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think you can see something to that effect and even larger with aging alone, and we do see it in males and females. But let's say there is this effect of menopause and it's 31 calories a day. The answer to that would be just purely based on the calorie number. So what? I mean, and that doesn't diminish any of the other elements of menopause, for which there's a lot of real physiological change happening, obviously. But if you came to me with a problem and said, I don't care what the cause is, huge issue, energy expenditure has changed by 30 calories a day, that's really not going to move the needle much, in terms of, real world outcomes. If it's a one-time change of 30 calories, your body weight may change by, frankly, an undetectable amount, and then you're going to plateau at that new body weight, and you may never notice that something like that occurred. And so that's the thing is, when you're looking at these papers, that would be my little add-in to that answer would be, everything you said, Lauren, but at the end of the day, stay tethered in stuff that matters. Keep yourself anchored to reality and practical application, where you're looking at this paper and saying, okay, so you've told me in these very elegant terms what ought to happen, what should happen, what's supposed to happen based on hormones and receptors and all this green arrows and red arrows and plus signs and minus signs. But at the end of the day, show me in the humans where this matters and therefore needs to be acted upon. I think a lot of times that's where I try to keep my brain, and that helps guard me against getting dazzled too much by some of the mechanistic discussions.
I think there's also a question of, let's say, for argument's sake, this were true and there was a decrease in resting energy expenditure or exercise energy expenditure. If that were true, we would have no idea if it actually were attributable to changes in estrogen or FSH. So the argument that I'm hearing is this is happening, it's clearly hormonal, and therefore we need hormone therapy.
Right.
Which this is taking so many leaps when it could be this isn't happening at all. It could be this is happening, but not to a meaningful degree. It could be this is happening, but it has nothing to do with these hormones. Or it could be this is happening and perhaps it's coinciding with changes in these hormones, but actually administering those hormones doesn't remedy the problem. So we might be left in a scenario of, even if this were true, the hormone piece of it is not something actionable. And therefore, we're left to adjust our diet and physical activity and sleep and stress and all the other.
Yeah. If I may, though, Lauren, I think we've interrogated the paper. I think now we're in the kind of open discussion section of the episode, I think.
I'll say one more thing about the
Okay.
paper, just because I think they, in the conclusion, direct quotes here, research on the effects of the menopausal transition on energetic adaptations are scarce. Future studies are needed to determine the independent effects of these parameters in women. Importantly, the intertwining effects of chronological aging and menopause-associated hormonal changes on these energetic adaptations are inherently difficult to separate. So basically, we have the authors acknowledging that there isn't a lot of research that can actually point to these changes and the menopause transition. And menopause and aging are inextricably linked. So they're basically saying future studies would be required to kind of try to tease these out, even though it's going to be difficult. We don't know if there are potential strategies that we might implement to address these adaptations if they exist. And we would, we should further explore the role of estrogen and FSH, excuse me. So despite where we started with the kind of claims from Dr. Haver and even the abstract that these authors wrote, they come to a conclusion that is far less confident than we might have assumed reading that abstract and looking at those figures.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you look at that that conclusion, and that's pretty there's some elements you could certainly nitpick, but that's a little bit more down to more in line with what I would call the reality of the data that kind of jumps out in the tables, which is good. But yeah, so I think one of the things I was going to ask here with this, because I mean, I just want to reiterate one point though, which is that they're talking about how menopause coincides with aging naturally, and it's hard to tease those out. I will say, when we do look at like the study you mentioned by my colleague Herman Poncer, when we look at these longitudinal data sets, I'm sorry, not longitudinal, cross-sectional data sets that span basically the entire human lifespan. One thing that's interesting is you can look at the effects of age on energy expenditure, seeing how it kind of tracks year over year. And one thing that's noteworthy is there was not a blip in that data around the typical age of menopause. The
Yeah.
male and female trajectories due to age were virtually identical, to the extent that if you're telling me that there is some, massive menopause effect embedded within that data, clearly there's a completely equal element that's happening in males, which physiologically doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. So yeah, I think a lot of the studies, and we even saw, when we went through that first table, a lot of the studies will literally conclude like it looks like things happened as they got older, but menopause didn't really have much to do with it, in a lot of those individual studies. Now, and when I say things happen, I mean in terms of energy expenditure specifically. So again, I don't want to downplay the multifaceted physiological changes. Menopause is a very fascinating transition where there's a lot happening. But again, I'm talking just energy expenditure. But Lauren, the question I wanted to ask you when I was asking for permission to go to the free discussion portion of the program, basically,
Do you want to take the paper down? Is it the paper still?
okay, that works. Yeah. Uh, I was kind of liking this because I didn't feel pressure to look as good as I normally do, But anyway, what I was going to ask is, so we talked about how it's quite a leap to get from the tables that we saw to the abstract, and I think the conclusion was a lot more suitable rather than the abstract. Here's my question: where did we get all the stuff about calories in, calories out? I don't even know where that came completely out of left field in terms of the claims you were talking about on social media. Like, how exactly was this the nail in the coffin for calories in, calories out?
Well, she it basically said clearly all of these hormonal changes are down regulating every aspect of energy expenditure. So it's not you it's not about just eat less, move more. It's about your biology,
Okay,
which again is a tough argument
can I just?
because go for it.
I'm sorry, I have to. I don't understand why we keep having this conversation. We meaning like influencer says blank, and then we're just like, what are you talking about? To say that basically what that argument is, Lauren, and I think this is a very fair way to summarize it. Calories in, calories out doesn't work because calories out can change a little. That's pretty much what that argument is. Like when you say like
Right.
these things are getting slightly downregulated, maybe, and that's a heavy maybe.
Heavy, maybe.
So all that means is, oh, well, then when calories out goes down, you should probably, uh, you know, drop the calories in a little bit or do things to rectify the drop in calories out. And there's absolutely nothing in this paper that would say, by the way, if you dramatically increase your exercise, it will not change your energy expenditure whatsoever because of menopause. Like that's not a realistic claim anyone can make. So I'm sure that if you actually like sat down with her and said, please defend that statement, there would be all sorts of like, well, what I really meant is blank. But I'm just on the surface that doesn't make any sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that even if we were to conclude, and to be clear, I do not think we can conclude, but
Yeah.
even if we were to conclude that there are these changes, then where does that leave us? Because if I mean, let's say energy expenditure is downregulated for some time for some reason, then the question is, and what do you do about it? If then we are left with, okay, well, we can change the calories in or the calories out, then inserts the hormone conversation, which is why I think that's sort of where this is going, is that it's not about calories, it's about hormones, and therefore, if you are on an estrogen based hormone therapy, then you can rectify this drop in energy expenditure for which we have no evidence.
Yeah.
Like we're making an assumption that this happens, and then an assumption that it's attributable to changes in hormones, and then making a claim that by using these hormones fix the hypothetical problem.
Yeah. Yeah. There's basically, yeah. a massive leap towards asserting there's a problem, a massive leap toward asserting how you would actually fix that, and certainly no empirical data to actually show you that whole process playing out. So, not ideal, not where you want to be. Now, Lauren, I think we are a little long for this episode, so it might be time to kind of, wrap things up and work toward our grand finale here.
Sure. Well, this is an unusual episode for us. Usually we keep it a little lighter. Anyone who is tuning in for the first time, Eric and I have been friends for a long time. We are co-owners of the Mass Research Review, and we record together every week. And we typically go through a lot of the headlines or hot topics in the health and fitness world, but we keep it light and we try not to take ourselves too seriously because I think we need some levity in the conversation around what's going on online these days.
Yeah, but unfortunately, today, new listener, you ran into the buzzsaw that is Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple laying down the law when someone says things about the research topic where she did her PhD and has so much passion. So you start throwing around these hormone statements and how they impact the physiology and fitness ramifications for women. Then all the levity goes out the window. Many years of friendship effectively down the drain in terms of our
Right.
online rapport. It's just she is on a war path, and I am just trying to keep her. I don't want to say I can't actually restrain where you're going in any way. I just try to keep you legally in a good spot. I try to make sure you don't say
Yeah.
anything that both of us will regret. So that was the episode today. Normally, yeah, like you said, we'll do 4 or 5 different topics, generally talking about whether or not you need to have a bath butler, all sorts of things about what happens if you eat 30 eggs a day. But in this case, it was just pure science. And so, yeah, if I will say, if you like this, then boy, oh boy, will you like the Mass Research Review, where Lauren and I every month write articles about the newest, hottest topics in terms of new research in health, exercise, nutrition, you name it. And what's cool about Mass is sometimes we will write about papers where we say, hey, here's a really cool new finding and here's how you use it. And then other times we'll have articles like this episode where we say, hey, everyone's saying that there's some cool new research in how to use it, and steer away from that advice because here's the real deal.
I will end on one headline because, our usual crew is very disappointed that we didn't have any headlines, and this is just good. It's from the New York Post, a publication that's very near and dear to my heart, and the headline is the plogging fitness trend is taking over New York City's dirty streets and keeping people in shape. Do you know what plogging is, Trex?
Plogging. It's got to have something to do with jogging, but what does the PL mean? Does it mean jogging in place? Plogging.
No. It's combining jogging with the Swedish phrase plocka up, meaning pick up. And this is people who run around New York picking up trash.
Oh, well, okay. I would say, like, if it's a fitness trend that helps New York be a little bit less smelly, then I think I'm on board with that. How do you feel about it?
I gotta say, we didn't need a name for this, guys.
Yeah, and
We
I,
don't need a
I
name for
will
this.
also say, even among the things that we've decided to name, maybe against our better judgment, that's such a stretch to be like, well, you wouldn't really get it if you don't speak Swedish. It's like, why do we need to do that? this is, we're picking up trash in New York. Why do we need to go to the Swedish dictionary to figure this one out?
Yeah. And, I don't think I want to jog with trash because it could be leaking. It
Yeah.
might smell, and then I'm gonna smell. And so let's go for a walk and pick up trash and then maybe throw out our trash and then go for the jog. That would be my preference.
Well, okay, call back to last episode. Would you rather, which one bothers you less? You're jogging and picking up trash, or you're jogging and churning butter at the same time, which you will then consume after the run?
Those are both gross to me because I don't want to run with things that could leak into my backpack or splash down my leg.
So here's the saving grace, though. I'd like to speak to a lawyer, or if we have any individuals involved in law enforcement in the live chat. What is the legality? Let's say that I'm doing this plogging. You got to speak Swedish to know what I'm talking about. But let's say I'm plogging, as you do in New York City, and I go and I pick up some trash, and they overfilled the bag, which is a huge mistake, or they have some kind of sharp corners in the bag. So the bag starts splitting and leaking.
Oh,
Okay. And
yeah.
as I'm jogging, I say, this isn't going well. This is leaking everywhere. And I put the bag back down. Have I littered, Lauren?
I thought you were gonna say, what if you pick up the trash and it's full of 2 million shards of broken glass from a window and then it cuts you? Is there anyone you can sue?
No,
But
no,
you
no.
bring up an interesting point.
No, have I
Are
littered
you
if
the litterer?
I'm now the steward of this bag of garbage once
I
I pick
think
it
you
up.
have.
Yeah, so
I
now
think you've littered.
that's my big issue
You're
with.
good. That's a good deed going punished.
Yeah, it reminds me of like when you hear about people who like did CPR on a dying person and saved their life, and then they get sued for bruising their ribs. It's like I tried to clean up the city. It went wrong. I had like garbage juice leaking out as I was running. I set it down for a minute. I was gonna come back, but yeah, I could see. We need a lawyer to weigh in on what is the legal exposure of plogging if things go wrong.
Also, has anyone ever been sued for littering in New York City? Because I don't think it's a
Based on
thing.
my experience, no. There's no way, because when I went to, basically with the amount of trash I saw everywhere and the amount of people I saw existing, there's no way that they were actually being processed and booked. Like for all the trash, there must have been such a huge number of people that were currently being booked in jail. Clearly, they're not getting picked up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No offense to New York. I will say, when I go there, I say it is so cool that I can just, walk out the front door. I'm on a subway. All of a sudden, I'm across the city. I'm getting some, very unique cuisine that I can't find anywhere else. But yeah, if we could just do a little bit about the garbage, the smell, and whatever species of rat that is, because they're quite substantial.
Yeah. Those are not the kind of rats that are used in the lab.
Yeah, there's been some kind of genetic modification that's occurred through years and years of eating pizza and selective breeding.
They have unlimited access to pizza.
Yeah. All
They
right,
have
Lauren.
some obese rats.
It is true.
Yeah.
All right, so we've alienated all of our New York listeners, but Lauren is actually from New York, and so that means we're
I'm
allowed
a
to
New
do
Yorker.
it, right?
It's the greatest city in the world.
Yep. All right. Anything you want to say to the good people before we sign off?
Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in live or for listening on replay. I love the emails, so keep them coming. Frontpagefitnesspodcast@gmail.com.
All right. Thanks, folks. Really appreciate you. Appreciate everyone showing up early in the live chat. Props for staying tuned on social media. It was a pleasure as always. Thank you for joining us, and we will be back with another episode in 7 days.